You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. The Bay Area needs to add housing if it's going to continue adding jobs. At the same time, like the rest of the state, it should be using less water. A new report says both can be done.
What we're arguing in the report is that just looking at the technology that's available on the shelves these days and the improvements available, if we just continue those trends for the next 5 decades, that we could actually decrease water use for the whole Bay Area by about a quarter, and we could therefore leave a portion of that water for the ecosystems.
And if we want water to stay affordable, we better plan ahead now.
The energy sector had its energy affordability crisis in the 1970s. That crisis moment hasn't happened in water yet, so here's hoping that we can offer affordability programs for people who need it before the crisis happens.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. I took a nice little field trip to Salesforce Park this week to talk about water, since the park has a variety of water efficiency strategies in place. I was meeting Laura Feinstein, Sustainability and Resilience Policy Director at the urbanist think tank SPUR.
They're using recycled water to irrigate the garden, and then they've planted plants that are climate appropriate. So that means that they didn't necessarily come from California, but they come from climates that are similar to California's. So they don't need a lot of additional water to grow.
These like huge plants do not look like California natives, but maybe I'm wrong there.
Well, they actually do look like a type of California native. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There is a plant that grows in places where it gets overgrazed by cows, but the leaves are smaller than this.
I mean, these are huge. I could use this for a bed if it wasn't spiky.
Yeah, it's very intimidating.
The plants are pretty cool, but as we were looking for a place to sit and talk, all of a sudden, these jets of water start shooting out of the ground a few steps away. The park has a water feature.
I feel like some poor unsuspecting soul must walk on top of those. Sprayed every once in a while.
Then just get jetted into space. Yeah, I wonder what controls the jets. I was not expecting fountains of water to shoot out of the ground.
Hopefully it's recycled water.
Yeah. Does that make it like reasonable water use if it's using recycled water?
I'm not persuaded. They'd have to tell me that there was some good reason to need to shoot jets of water around. Because all water is recycled, right? Everything that you drink, everything from a river has been recycled many, many, many times. So I don't view recycled water as less valuable than any other water.
How do you feel about water features in general that are decorative?
I think if they're using recycled water, they're sort of okay, but I think in the long run, if the goal is for California to be able to grow the way that it needs to grow, it's going to have to think about how to do that without using additional water, and that means some of the optional things will have to go, and that would probably include water features.
Yeah. Putting aside the surprise fountain, which doesn't run continuously, Salesforce Park is modeling a few different types of water conservation strategies. So does Salesforce Tower, which has a water recycling program. But shiny new skyscrapers are not the only pillar of water efficiency in town. In fact, low-income housing buildings around the city have initiated programs like fixing leaks and installing low-flow fixtures. The Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, an affordable housing provider, has committed to reducing its water use 20% over 10 years by 2029. These are some strategies that, according to a new report from SPUR, along with the water use think tank the Pacific Institute, could help the Bay Area reduce its overall water use, even as it adds millions of residents and homes. Because projections do indicate that the region is going to attract more jobs and more people.
So SPUR did a regional strategy, and one of the core pieces of work for that was that we did some economic modeling of the future of the Bay Area. And we basically said, we took projections that others had developed around how many additional jobs the Bay Area would add in the next 50 years. And we said, assuming that that is true, how do we prevent what we've seen over the last few decades from getting worse, which is the Bay Area not building enough new housing to keep up with all the people who want to move here, which then has pushed up housing prices and meant that people are struggling with affordability in the region. So assuming that the region will add 2 million million new jobs by 2070. That means that will attract about 4 million new people to the region. And so in order to build enough housing to deal with the deficit we have right now and to prevent housing affordability from getting worse, we need to build an estimated 2.2 additional new homes.
The notion that we could grow without using more water wasn't pulled out of thin air. We've done this before.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but since the 1980s, the Bay Area has grown by about 25% in population, and yet it's decreased its total water use by about 25%. And so it did that by decreasing per person water use. So people are using water more efficiently indoors, they're using less water outdoors to irrigate their yards, and businesses are using less water to produce their goods. And add that all up together, and the region is using about half the water per capita as we were using in 1970s.
The report says that the Bay Area can do this. The Bay Area can add millions of new people, millions of new homes, and then offset all the water use from that growth. And there's two methods for this: better water use efficiency and growing in already developed areas. It sounds like preventing sprawl. And I think a lot of the report kind of deals with this. Could you talk a bit about why preventing sprawl is important to water use?
There's a couple reasons why growing in a compact way has a lower water footprint than growing in a sprawling fashion. The big reason is that about half of people's water use is outdoors. It's watering their yards. So if you convert a field, which is not being watered, to a development and you add in a lot of yard space, all of a sudden that's new water use that wasn't there before. But if you take an existing yard and you add a new accessory dwelling unit in it, or you put a second story onto a one-story building and add a second unit, all you're adding is the indoor water use. You're not adding any additional outdoor water use for yards. So that infill development has a much lower water footprint than sprawl development. And then the other thing to think about is simply that yards are smaller when you do this type of infill development, and people are sharing their outdoor space. So instead of each home having a big yard, you have an apartment building where you have 4 or 5 or 20 people sharing a yard. And hopefully you're building shared green spaces like the one we're sitting in right now, so that people can still enjoy green spaces and the outdoors, but it's shared so that water use is split among them.
You might be thinking about how agriculture and industry are generally the biggest water consumers. So why would household use be so important? Statewide, yes, the agriculture sector is the largest water user, accounting for 80% of consumption. But in the Bay Area specifically, 90% of water use goes to supplying homes and businesses. Of that 90%, indoor residential use actually consumes the largest share, and that's followed, closely, by businesses and institutions. These are areas where the region can be more efficient.
So in the Bay Area these days, water use is pretty evenly split between indoor in people's homes, outdoor in people's homes, and then what's generally called the commercial, industrial, institutional sector. So that's just everything that doesn't fit into that big pot of home water use. So I'll just call that the business sector for now. And there's actually big opportunities to decrease water use in all three sectors. So outdoors, the big things are that people have really grown accustomed to planting a type of landscaping that became fashionable centuries ago in upper crust gardens in Europe. And it's not the types of plants that naturally grow in California with the relatively modest amount of rain that we get every year. But if people kind of shift their way of thinking and start to embrace the types of plants that grow in California's Mediterranean climate, they really are very beautiful, and they also can be host to a lot more native insects and birds and are really enjoyable gardens. The other big thing to do indoors in people's homes is to be putting in the most efficient devices that are available. The biggest water uses are toilets and showers, so getting the best available toilet, the most efficient shower heads, and also fixing leaks. People lose about 10% of their water use just to leaks in their homes. So detecting those, many water utilities will give you a free inspection. And so finding those leaks and fixing them is huge. And then businesses as well, over the past few decades, have been decreasing their water use about 1% each year, which is pretty good. But there hasn't really been any statutes passed recently to require business to increase their efficiency. But with some goals and benchmarks in place, we think they likely could continue that trend of decreasing water use every year. The big things to think about are that the region can grow without using more water. However, in order to do that, we need to be thinking long-term about all the opportunities to increase efficiency when they happen. So that means things like when people are renovating their homes, putting in more efficient devices, or when people are overhauling their yards, they shouldn't be putting in grass or the same types of landscaping that they used to. They need to be putting in more efficient landscaping. So long-term, the big takeaway is that the region needs to build more housing in particular to make the region more equitable for people to be able to come here and live here affordably, and that we don't need to see that as a zero-sum game for the environment, that we can be making our region greener and more water efficient while also accommodating more housing.
Another thing the region needs to figure out is water allocation. Utilities divert water from rivers, then distribute it to municipalities. And how much water a city gets affects more than its day-to-day water use. It's linked, again, with growth.
One of the things that's really challenging is that even though at a regional scale there is enough water for building the housing that the region needs, there's some areas in the Bay Area that really are likely to receive a lot of the housing growth in coming decades. So places that are big job centers and are big hubs for transportation are natural places to put new housing, because then people can access jobs, they can access good schools, they can ride public transit instead of having to drive. So there's a lot of reasons to build in a dense fashion in those places that have the best resources. But that means that you really start clumping all your water demand in a few places. And historically, California has not distributed water according to need. Water is distributed according to the water rights that people got many decades ago. And that means that, for example, San Francisco or East Bay Municipal Utility District have these very senior water rights and have quite a bit of water available to them every year, even in drought years. And then there's other places that don't have nearly as senior water rights and don't have as much water available. And in some cases, those are areas that are really going to start to bump up against the limits of their supply as they grow. So being able to share some of the abundance with those places that really are resource limited would help the region sort of grow in a more environmentally sustainable way in many aspects.
We'll explain that some more and how water distribution has an equity problem when we get back to this conversation in just a moment. You've been listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. The annual News Match Challenge is going on right now. That means when you support our work, your donation will be matched by a pool of funds created to support local news. If you value the in-depth reporting and storytelling that we do here at the Public Press and with Civic, and you're in a position to support it, you can help keep our content paywall and ad-free with a donation. And because the News Match campaign will run through the end of the year, your impact will be doubled. You can join today at sfpublicpress.org. Become a monthly supporter or give a one-time gift. And if that's not in the cards for you right now, you can still make a difference. Help more people find Civic and the Public Press. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. Share a link to a story, or just tell your friends and your family about what you're hearing. However you choose to support us, you have our sincere thanks. Let's talk some more about water efficiency and how the region can add more homes and people without increasing its water use. I want to use an example to illustrate not just how water supply and growth are intertwined, but also how water allocation has an equity problem. The example is a city a little bit south of here on the peninsula.
So the case of East Palo Alto was a fascinating case study in how historical injustices have continued to be carried through, and you can see them manifest in water. So East Palo Alto is the poorest city on the peninsula south of San Francisco. It's surrounded by these extremely wealthy communities in Silicon Valley, and it also had the lowest per person water use of any of the communities around it, and yet it also had a very low per person water allocation. So the cities on the peninsula get most of their water from purchasing it from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So the water comes down mostly from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir down through aqueducts, and then San Francisco Public Utilities Commission provides water to San Francisco, and then it also resells it to a big portion of the Bay Area along the peninsula and the South Bay and even into the East Bay. And every city gets a certain designated allocation, and East Palo Alto, when they were handing out those allocations decades ago, got a sort of, I could say, inexplicably small allocation, but it's not that inexplicable. As always, the town that was primarily people of color and that was lower income got the least amount when the negotiations were happening. And so then they ended up at a point where they could no longer build any new development just a few years ago because they had no water. So there were then negotiations, and then fortunately some of the two neighboring towns that really had allocations that were quite large and they couldn't use all of it did agree to sell a portion of their allocation to East Palo Alto.
I know we've been talking about ways that the Bay Area can build more without using more water, but a twisted flip side to that is this. Not having enough water in the first place can stop a community from growing. In some cases, cities did or do not have enough water available to service new construction as well as existing uses. So they stop construction.
So we took a look at building moratoriums, so cases where cities or water districts had said that they could not supply any new additional development because they didn't have enough water. And we found close to 40 communities around California that at one time had a building moratorium in place. Most of them, they were temporary and they lifted them at the end of some drought emergency, but there are communities around California that still have them in place.
I'm curious about this idea of the lack of availability of water actually stopping new construction and growth at the same time as we need to reduce water as we grow.
Right. I'm saying that we can grow without using more water, and yet there's towns that said we can't grow because we don't have enough water. So the key is that you really need to do long-term planning in order to grow without using more water. So you can't just snap your fingers and suddenly everybody slashes their water use in half overnight. People need the water that they're using right now. But if you're planning long run to put in efficiencies, then, for example, you only have available for sale the most efficient available appliances so that when things break, people are putting the more efficient appliances in their homes. You're setting benchmarks for businesses so that gradually over time they're ratcheting down their water use. It takes decades to really decrease water use on a per capita basis really substantially. So we can't just do it overnight. We have to be looking decades out to see those big gains in efficiency.
And of course, how we use water here in San Francisco or in another nearby city does have effects on other people and places. We just might not see them.
In San Francisco, it's kind of we try to use water effectively, but I haven't been personally affected by this latest drought, I have to say, and I don't think that experience is universal.
So one of the things that's tough is getting people who live in cities that have these very secure water supplies to understand that their water use does have a huge impact upstream, but it tends to be out of sight. So the big cities in California generally have a fairly generous water allocations. And yes, they do have to cut back during a drought. For example, everybody was supposed to cut back 15 or 20% during the last drought, which people primarily do by cutting back on things that are optional, like not watering outdoors as much, for example. But there are places in California that are dealing with the impacts of other people's water use. So, for example, upstream in the Delta, the communities in Stockton and around there live alongside rivers that are generally choked with algae. And it's becoming a year-round problem. And that is largely attributable to the fact that so much water is diverted from the rivers upstream of the Delta that the water has sort of slowed to a trickle and become warmer, and the climate is warming, and so algae blooms in those situations. So that's due largely to farms and cities that divert the water, and then therefore there's communities upstream that can't enjoy their rivers because of that.
So if we just use less water, more of it will stay in the rivers, and these environmental impacts will be reduced, right? Not quite.
One thing that threw me was that the report recommends that we strengthen mechanisms to ensure that a portion of water saved through conservation and efficiency is restored to the environment. And I have to admit that I was thinking that if we conserve water and we don't use it, it stays in the environment and there is no, we have to go put it back.
So one of the things that is tough is that over the past few decades, cities have become much more efficient in how they use water, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that water gets left in rivers. That means often that that water then gets reallocated to some other human use. So either to grow more, so you're using less water per capita, but you're putting in more development, so total water use stays the same, or there's other farms, there's other cities that will happily take that water. And right now, there's no way to ensure that if the city of San Francisco decreases its total water use by 10%, then that amount of water stays in the rivers of the Sierra rather than being diverted. It just means that another person who's in line for water is likely going to take the water.
So what do we have to do to put it back?
One of the big mechanisms would be to dedicate a water right to the environment. So right now, water rights are only for people and agencies that represent people, so cities and farms and so on. So people have water rights, but the environment does not. So that means that the only way to sort of protect the amount of water that stays in rivers, especially during drought years, is through enforcing things like the Endangered Species Act or certain water quality protections. And that becomes very, very tricky. Whereas if the environment simply had a water right, so that just like everybody else, it had an amount that it had a right to before others were allowed to take their due share, then you could ensure that a certain amount stayed in the rivers and kept the ecosystems healthy.
A state regulator, the Water Board, has told the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission it should reduce the amount of water it diverts from rivers in the first place to address this.
So the idea is that the delta is much too salty during drought years because too much fresh water gets diverted from the rivers before it can make it into the delta. And that contributes to all sorts of problems. It means that some water districts can't take the water that they need because it's getting too salty. It means that certain fish can't survive in the delta anymore. So the plan on the table is to require certain rivers to keep a larger amount of their flow, even in drought years. And that would potentially mean that some water agencies would have to take less water from those rivers, which some water agencies are saying they simply can't do.
The utility essentially says that complying with these restrictions would be exceedingly burdensome. I talked about this a while back with someone from the SFPUC, Assistant General Manager for Water, Stephen Ritchie. He said there are two issues here. The first came up in late 2018 when the state made changes to the Water Quality Control Plan that would require 40% of unimpaired flow to remain in the Tuolumne River. The second is about the hydroelectric facility at Don Pedro Dam. The SFPUC has a number of agreements with local irrigation districts around that dam, one of which says that if the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which licenses these facilities, requires more flow in the river for fisheries, the SFPUC will provide about half of that. The federal government manages licenses, and it's the state's responsibility to work out the terms of operation. The state sent a proposal to the federal agency with what Ritchie described as new restrictions that went even farther than its water quality control plan from 2018, without telling the SFPUC.
It included the water quality control plan requirements, plus a whole lot more that was well beyond the water quality control plan, things that had not even been discussed with anyone, including us and the irrigation districts, and put that into the water quality certification they sent to FERC. We petitioned the State Water Board to at least hold a hearing on it and reconsider that, because all those additional requirements more than doubled the water supply hit that we would feel from just the water quality control plan by itself. The State Board basically chose not to take it up, not to hold a hearing on it, and so we felt compelled to litigate on the water quality certification as well, because it wasn't just reiteration of the water quality control plan. It was an increase in requirements, which we think was kind of a harsh move by the state in light of all of the conversations going on about potential settlements and other things. And so the state chose to do it that way.
So that makes sense to some degree to me, a layperson who doesn't know most of these acronyms or these agreements. But what I'm kind of confused about is if San Francisco is actually distributing a lot of what it's getting from out of town to other municipalities, selling that, then why would it be such a dramatic hit to us if we had to comply with these restrictions?
Well, it would be a dramatic hit to our entire service area, both in San Francisco and outside of San Francisco. And we have the responsibility for providing supply to San Franciscans, but we also have a contract with the folks outside of San Francisco that we are obligated to supply to them up to 184 million gallons per day. They don't use nearly that much now, but even at lower levels of demand, the restrictions that would have to be in place to meet the state's requirements, pending, trying to identify additional water supplies, would really be harmful to the communities and the Bay Area as a whole. Water is essential to a thriving economy. We all would bear that burden. In fact, we would probably bear a lesser burden in San Francisco because we are already using water so efficiently, and our contract with our wholesale customer recognizes that. But when we're talking about the volumes of water that the state is talking about, it really, would carry us well beyond where we are now.
Laura Feinstein with SPUR says with long-term planning and not really a whole lot of new technology, we can get well beyond where we are now.
What we're arguing in the report is that just looking at the technology that's available on the shelves these days and the improvements available in landscaping and what businesses have been doing to make themselves more efficient, if we just continue those trends for the next 5 decades, that per capita water use and total water use would drop off quite a bit, that we could actually decrease water use for the whole Bay Area by about a quarter, and we could therefore leave a portion of that water for the ecosystems.
And thinking in the long term, we know water is a precious resource, which means it can get expensive. So water efficiency is also an affordability issue.
One of the things that I think is important to recognize is that water affordability is becoming a bigger issue for people. More and more people, usually lower income people, are having trouble paying their water bills regularly. And so one of the big reasons to think about how to use water more efficiently is that you then don't have to put in all these new big infrastructure projects, which are very expensive. So it means that you don't have to necessarily build new dams, and you don't have to build new or larger drinking water treatment plants if you're making your water use more efficient. Between climate change and more pollution in the environment and a greater recognition of how those pollutions affect human health is all adding up to drinking water agencies needing to treat their water more than they used to. And also to build new infrastructure projects, things like recycled water and so on. And all of that contributes to water rates going up. So I think it's likely that water rates will continue to go up. They have been for the past few decades. And that means that water agencies will need to think more about how to effectively deliver discounts to their low-income customers. Because while there are discount programs on water bills, they aren't nearly as well implemented as they are in, for example, the energy sector. So, the energy sector had its energy affordability crisis in the 1970s, and there was a huge response. All these federal programs were rolled out to give people discounts on their energy bills to keep the energy on, especially during the winter. And that crisis moment hasn't happened in water yet. So here's hoping that we can offer affordability programs for people who need it before the crisis happens.
Here's hoping. You can read the report yourself at spur.org. I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Our staff here includes publisher Lila LaHood, executive director Michael Stoll, assistant editor Noah Arroyo, copy chief Kurt Aguilar, photojournalist and reporter Jessica Prado, and reporter Nula Bishari. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP. New episodes every Thursday. Thanks for listening.